So we're going to start talking about UTXO management, the different strategies we have for that. UTXO stands for unspent transaction output. And there can be some concern based on your UTXO size potentially in the future, it being too small to spend. Can happen if you send Bitcoin and there's like a small amount, a few sats left over. And this is kind of like the change back after spending, dollars. That's one way to look at it and compare it. And then sometimes because there's minor fees, right, with on-chain Bitcoin, the minor fees can be too high compared to the actual amount you have as a UTXO. So it becomes inefficient to spend that amount of Bitcoin. So it's something to think about. It's something to learn about. And we're going to share kind of the different strats that we've done in the past, different amounts you might want to think about. And just some different ideas around UTXO management. If you guys, if one of you guys wants to launch into maybe one of the things to think about here.
For sure. Let's start with mempool. Can you just accept my screen share there? So on mempool, you can see what exactly a UTXO consolidation is. So let's say, for example, you go into one of these transactions here. Actually, I'll go into one of the ones that have already been confirmed. So if we go into one of these blocks here, we can see that there's some massive blocks of transactions. So what we see here is, let's say if we go into this one, we're going to see here that this one has a bunch of UTXOs, a bunch of small UTXOs, 500 UTXOs, and they've all been consolidated. So basically what they did was they moved the Bitcoin from these multiple addresses here, and they put it all into this one address. So if we scroll down, we can see how many UTXOs there really is. This is crazy.
It's crazy.
And so this transaction, if we look, I think the thing that you need to really look at is the more UTXOs you have, the more chunks of Bitcoin that you have, the bigger the size of the transaction is going to be. So in this case, we have 74.04 kilobytes and 33.92 kilo VBytes, kilo virtual bytes. If we go to another transaction here, let me show you another one. So we'll actually look at the transaction fees for this one. So the fees were $103. But if we go to another transaction on the same block, let me just go to this one back here. And if we go all the way to the end, we can see, so that one cost $103, but we see here that there are transactions that cost 34 cents, 43 cents. So if you manage your UTXOs properly, if you consolidate all those chunks of Bitcoin, again, there's another one here, 546 Satoshis. If you manage your UTXOs properly, it's going to be much cheaper for you to transact on Bitcoin later on.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that a lot of people, they see the term UTXO, they hear unspent whatever. Even myself, I'm just like, okay, it took me a while to figure this out, and I learned a lot of hard lessons myself. And I think it's important. That's kind of why we're doing this show, why we have our channels, is because we've been through this before. We've made mistakes, and the purpose of sharing this stuff isn't to brag or anything. It's to make sure that, maybe it doesn't happen to you in the future like it did to us. So I'll give you an example of something that happened to me, I think, so people can kind of get a true sense of what could go wrong here. So I was DCAing. That's kind of what people are told within Bitcoin is to DCA. It's a good way to accumulate sats.
So DCA stands for dollar cost average, by the way, just in case people don't know, that's what it stands for.
Right. Thank you. And so every week, pretty much, because I was trying to buy the average with this, I was buying every week. And so I'd buy, let's say, $10 or $15 or $20 worth of Bitcoin every Friday buy day. And then I would send it from ShakePay to my cold storage, because that's also what I had been told to do by YouTube, by my YouTube mentors. So I basically sent every week for maybe a year and a half. I sent, let's say, $5, $10, $15 worth of Bitcoin over to my cold storage, thinking I was doing it right. I was taking custody of it. I was DCAing. I was doing everything YouTube told me to do. So then when I learned what a UTXO was and how this could be such an issue in the future, I was like, okay, I gotta consolidate these, as Rajat just showed there. Because when you consolidate them, basically you take all those and you put them into one new UTXO, one new block there. And so it ended up costing me about 250,000 sats to do that.
Wow.
Which at the time was just over $100, I think. And today would be about $300 to send one single transaction there from my wallet. Because when you look at a wallet, you'll see the balance in there, which is the total amount of Bitcoin that you have the keys to that you can spend. But that balance that you see there, it's actually made up of a whole bunch of different UTXOs, or if you're doing it right, 1 or 2 or 3. But in my case, I had about 150 UTXOs that made up my balance. And when I went to consolidate that, it actually cost me about 250,000 sats to do. And so that's kind of what we're trying to prevent people from doing. That's the lesson that I learned. I don't know if you guys have done something similar or that you can report on, or if you would just want to get into like, so how can we avoid that?
Yeah, one way we could avoid it is potentially. I mean, this might go against what some people say, and it goes against like that initial wisdom that you got from YouTube, which is leave your Bitcoin on an exchange longer, accumulate it more under one UTXO, and when you when you send that out to your hardware wallet, you've basically allowed it to consolidate under their management and into a bigger piece of Bitcoin or more sats, and then you can send that all at once, as opposed to these many frequent ones. That's a really simple way to do it. And of course, you want to manage the risk of how long do you want to hold your Bitcoin on an exchange for? How big do you think a UTXO should be? And in the future, how spendable will it be, depending on price, depending on miner fees, right? Right now, mining fees are pretty low, but if block space becomes really competitive, then the miner fees are going to go up. We also, with SegWit, that was a block size upgrade. So there was more block size after SegWit got introduced. So maybe in the future, Bitcoin could have different adjustments to it as well that make it cheaper. So it's really thinking about, checking out mempool.space, seeing what the fees are, deciding how big of a UTXO you want, and thinking about holding it in some sort of exchange or something that doesn't cost you to have miner fees every single time you build that stack. Those would be the things I would consider. And another one of those would be buying it and holding it in a Lightning wallet instead, or even on Liquid, where you're going to pay a lot less fees when you swap that into Bitcoin. So that's another way that we'll maybe get into a little bit deeper after this.
Just before we go into the Lightning, I think that's a great topic to talk about. But if we go into, I just wanted to visualize what the UTXOs look like. So for example, we have a pool of miners here that contribute all their resources to the Bitcoin network. And the Coinbase transaction is the new Bitcoin that are created and sent to them. So for example, we can see here that the Coinbase transaction went to this address here. This is actually a pretty cool update on mempool. So if you go into this address, you can see what kind of UTXOs they have. So they have a UTXO that has 3.14 Bitcoin, 3.19. You can also see the smaller one, 0.08, 0.08. So 8 million Satoshis, 10 million Satoshis, 12 million Satoshis. So this is pretty interesting. I would actually recommend going into this and looking through these, because it kind of helps you visualize what you're doing a little bit more. It's like having smaller chunks of gold, and then you have to go to, let's say, a goldsmith, and you have to tell them, melt them together for me. So you have to pay them to melt them together. That's your fee. That's your transaction fee. But then let's say, for example, you want to break them apart. You're going to have a certain cost associated with breaking them apart as well. So let's say you go back to the goldsmith, you tell them, I have this 1 kilogram bar of gold, and I want you to turn it into 20 chains or 20 little nuggets of gold. Basically, you're gonna have to pay them a fee again. And that's exactly what's happening here. So the more you have, the more of those chunks of Bitcoin that you have, the more space you take up on the Bitcoin blockchain, and the more it costs you to have your transaction approved. Because on the Bitcoin blockchain, the transaction fees are based on how many V-bytes you're using. So I mentioned the previous one where you had that UTXO consolidation, where it was something like 33.4 kilo V-bytes. But if we look at one of these smaller transactions, for example, if we look at this one, it'll be really tiny. So if we, let's see here, it doesn't show the, oh, sorry. I think I got to go all the way to the bottom, go to the transaction ID. Oh, there you go. Okay. So this one, for example, is 153 bytes. Versus the other one was like 33.4 kilobytes or something like that. So much bigger transaction means that it takes up more space on the blockchain, and it takes up more space on the nodes that people are running to enforce the Bitcoin protocol. So if you want to transact with more more UTXOs, you have to pay a higher fee because you're taking up a bigger amount of space on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Totally. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very important part, I think, for people to understand in terms of sending Bitcoin. It doesn't matter how much Bitcoin you're sending. Like you could send. There's no difference between sending 1 Bitcoin versus 20,000 Bitcoin. It all depends on the UTXOs. The 1 Bitcoin actually might cost you more to send if there's multiple UTXOs making up that 1 Bitcoin, right? Yeah. So it's important to understand. And I think going back to something that Forrest was talking about there in terms of buying and holding on ShakePay, I think it's important, or on an exchange that allows you to keep your Bitcoin on there. So I think it's important just to confirm this with people, the fact that if I did the exact same thing I did before, where I was talking about buying every week, if I actually just let that accumulate within something like ShakePay or an exchange that allows you to keep it on there, those aren't UTXOs that I'm responsible for every time. I actually don't create a UTXO until I move it out of the exchange and into my own wallet. So I think that is a lot of people kind of get confused there. They think that every time they buy, they create a new UTXO, but it's actually not until you move it into your own wallet and take custody of it where that creates one UTXO.
Yeah. When you buy from oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say an exchange is almost like a layer 2 of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
They have their own internal balance sheet and spreadsheet, basically, of all of these different Bitcoin accounts that they hold for people, cash accounts, Bitcoin accounts. And only when you move that off of the exchange are you actually interacting with the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, and like you said, they're just basically updating a spreadsheet. So let's say, for example, you put in a command to exchange $5 for Satoshis. They're going to update your spreadsheet, I guess your cell, by, let's say, 5,000 Satoshis, and they're going to say that you took out $5. They're not going to actually interact with the Bitcoin blockchain. They're just going to do it on their own end, on their own centralized database. And then when you get them to transfer to your own wallet, what they're doing is they're putting through a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain, and they're sending that Bitcoin from their address, because they control the addresses where the Bitcoins are. So they have control of that address that has the Bitcoin. And what you're doing is you're putting in an order to transfer that Bitcoin from their address to your address. So whenever you do that is when you create a UTXO.
And they'll probably do it in a very efficient way as well, which people, it's called a batch transaction.
Yeah.
So they'll probably wait a little bit, build up a bunch of different people wanting to withdraw Bitcoin. And so they'll send one UTXO and they'll split it up into dozens or hundreds of UTXOs to all their customers in a batch transaction. And again, the reason for that is because if they did a bunch of different transactions, it would take up more block space and it would be more expensive for them. And so that's why a lot of exchanges will cover the transaction fee or the miner fee. And it's because they batch a bunch of their transactions and do it once a day or every few hours or something like that.
So this is what a batched transaction could look like. I'm not saying that this is one, but this is what it could look like. For example, you have here one transaction with this many outputs that cost you $2.21. So you're paying how many outputs are there? 10, maybe 22 cents an output. In any other case, you'd be paying a lot more.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very cheap to batch transactions.
So I think it's pretty important to just kind of drill into that a little bit more, because this is something that when people are buying Bitcoin, this is something that they're going to have to deal with. And a lot of people it's very easy to buy Bitcoin, but if you don't know what you're doing, it can come back and really bite you in the ass in the future. So I think it's a good call here just to kind of walk through. Maybe Forrest talked about holding it on an exchange for a little while. I want to introduce another concept, which I use personally myself in my own setup, which is if you find an exchange, and this is important too, make sure you're using an exchange that has free withdrawals. Because I basically, for the first couple of years of my Bitcoin journey, I was buying on like a Binance. I think Coinbase is very similar, where they actually charge you every time you want to move Bitcoin off the exchange into your wallet, you get charged for that. So number one, make sure you're using an exchange that has free withdrawals to save you some sats. But what I do with my process is with a recurring buy. So let's say I'm going through the exact same scenario, like $10 a week. I use an exchange here in Canada called Bitcoin Well, which has free Lightning withdrawals. So I move it from the exchange, Bitcoin Well in this case, I move it to my Lightning wallet. And because that's not on layer 1, that's not a UTXO. That's a layer on top of the layer 1. So that doesn't count as a UTXO either. So I let it build up in there. And let's say I get it to 200,000 sats, 300,000 sats. Once I'm at a comfortable point where I'm good to move that on chain, that's where I move it from Lightning to on chain. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. You can use Bitcoin Well themselves, have free swaps. You can use AQUA wallet, where you send Lightning and swap it to Bitcoin, and then you can move it to your cold storage. But you kind of want to optimize this whole process to pay as little amount of fees as possible today and in the future. That's kind of what you want to be thinking about when you're buying Bitcoin. And so in my case, I get a free withdrawal to Lightning. It sits on there for a while. And then when I go to move it, if I use Bitcoin Well, it's free. So that's another 0 fee transaction. If I used AQUA wallet or something similar, they charge a couple sats on there. But you really want to make sure through the process of going from the exchange to your cold storage, you want to minimize the amount of sats and fees that you're paying there. That's kind of the idea of this video.
Yeah, definitely.
Easy. You can plan for the future if you want to through something like this. Like, this is an easy way to cut your costs later on. Let's say, for example, if you have, let's say Bitcoin becomes the world reserve currency and you have a bunch of UTXOs that are like 100 Satoshis each, you're not going to be able to use them.
Yeah. Yeah, which I guess leads to the question, like, how big should a UTXO be? Personally, I mean, it depends, right? Like, on how much money you can put into Bitcoin, right? How much savings do you have in Bitcoin? But I've seen, and it's really just opinion based, because it's projecting into the future of what will be spendable, and what will the miner fees be, and what will the layer 2s or how will this whole ecosystem develop. My own personal opinion is probably somewhere around 1 million sats. That's my opinion. And
so, I'm kind of on the other side of it too. And as Forrest mentioned here, like there's no perfect answer for everybody. I think that's kind of the point here, is that it is different based on your risk tolerance and your, how much you have total. So a lot of people will say 1 million. A lot of people might even say higher than that. Some people might say 10 million. I'm kind of on the fence of like anything over 100,000. That's usually what I advise people to move on to there. And the reason I said is because as Rajat started the show with here, the mempool fees are very low right now. You can consolidate later. You can wait until, fees are 1 sat per VByte on the mempool, and then you can consolidate. And I just feel more comfortable myself holding it on cold storage that's detached from the internet, as opposed to letting it build up for too long. So that's kind of my own personal risk trade-off there that I'm going with. But I definitely see both sides of it. So kind of my point is that there's no real right answer to it. It's just how much risk you can tolerate in terms of leaving it on like a hot wallet or a Lightning wallet or on an exchange.
Yeah, I've seen all kinds of estimates. I've seen people saying 100,000. I've seen people saying 1 million. I've seen people saying 250,000, for example. I was just looking through the cheapest transactions. Do you guys know if the transaction fees can go below 1 sat per VByte? Is that even possible?
I don't think it can now.
I don't believe so, no.
So the minimum...
I mean, you could technically put nothing in and you might get included, because it's just it's like a tip, right? These are tips to the miner to get included. But if there's no one else wanting to get included, they'll include your transaction.
I think the minimum that you need to include, or the minimum size of your transaction should be, or the minimum size of a transaction fee is about 110 sats.
Okay.
So I'm just looking at the transaction fees now. Like, there's one that 1 sat per VByte, 1.01 sats per VByte. The transaction fee is 110 sats. So
with one UTXO?
With one UTXO.
Yeah.
So that would probably be the minimum fee that you're ever going to pay. So if you have a UTXO that's smaller than that, you probably shouldn't have that in the first place. It's going to cost you more to, right? I mean, you could have ones, you could do, I think based on that, 100,000 is reasonable. I think 250,000 is reasonable. But if Bitcoin becomes the world reserve currency and we're constantly transacting on the Bitcoin network and banks are using it to transact and they're settling their funds daily, the transaction fees could go up. So make sure that you understand that.
Yeah. And that's the last thing that I want to mention here is that if you are somebody who's listening to this and you're like, holy, like I've been DCAing for a couple of years now. I had no idea what a UTXO was. I have a ton of them. I mean, the one thing I would say is just don't panic, because the worst thing you can do is like freak out and like pay 5 or 6 sats per VByte to try to consolidate it. And then you're just wasting sats, because historically anyways, we've seen the mempool get very busy, very congested, where fees are very high, but then it usually drops down. And we're in a perfect spot right now where it is 1 sat per VByte. So I would say if you are somebody who's like kind of too far gone right now, you're really not. You're still going to be able to take those UTXOs, just send one transaction, make sure that the mempool, I usually don't consolidate unless it's under like 3 sats per VByte. 1 is ideal, obviously. That's the perfect one if you can wait, if you're patient enough. But like, don't start consolidating when it's like, 5, 6, 7, 10. You're just going to be wasting sats. So just don't freak out. Just wait for the mempool to kind of clear out, which is today pretty much. Hopefully we should probably release this video soon. But like, wait until it's 1 sat per VByte. You're going to be fine.
Yeah, don't try to consolidate while people are doing ordinals and runes and all of that.
And I just want to show one last thing on my screen here. So we can see here, if you have a lot of UTXOs, don't panic too much. Like Jor said, we can see here, this was a transaction where we had 1,300, 1,400 UTXOs, and it cost them $100. So, I mean, if you have a lot of UTXOs, maybe now is the time to figure it out and to see what exactly is happening. You can actually set your own transaction fee. You can set it to 1 sat per VByte. I think I think you're fine. Don't panic too much. Don't worry about it. And by the way, Forrest, you were mentioning that there were some more blocks that were supposed to show up. I think I hadn't scrolled far enough.
Yeah, so the blocks are pretty empty down there at the low fees. So you could just be patient, and you can consolidate your UTXOs if you need to.
Simple.
And that's mempool.space for anybody who wants to check that out. I would say if you're somewhat new to Bitcoin, you spend an hour on mempool.space, you're gonna be a lot more knowledgeable in terms of the Bitcoin layer 1 anyways. So
yeah,
it's a good chat. Again, this is something that people have been asking me about quite a bit in terms of the process, because these are all things you got to think about. Unfortunately, there's not really an instruction manual for Bitcoin when you start buying it for the first time. So that's why shows like this exist. So you guys got anything else you want to add in before we wrap her up?
I think I'm good.
I think I'm good. Except, and we won't cover it here, but privacy is another thing with UTXOs and consolidating. Maybe just a quick little mention on that.
Yep.
If you have a bunch of UTXOs that are unconnected from each other and from you, and you consolidate them into one UTXO, those are now all connected to you, basically, because you've KYC'd yourself amongst those UTXOs. And then if you spend them somewhere and somebody can see your public wallet address, and out of that UTXO, they can see all prior transactions as well if they follow the blockchain back. So if privacy is a concern of yours of how you spend your UTXOs, that's something to consider as well, but probably beyond the scope of this video, which is just about consolidating UTXOs.
Yeah, I think it's important though, because that is something that people should be aware of when they're kind of mapping this out in their head. Like what I usually tell people when I'm helping them is like, what I've done anyways with my own stack is like, take like, you don't want one UTXO, you don't want 1,000 of them, but you also don't want one. And that's what Forrest is saying here is like, because when you go to spend that one UTXO or spend a portion of it, they're always going to be able to trace it back to the UTXO that you spent it from. So I think
they
somewhere
basically
between
see into your wallet, right? If you have one giant UTXO, they're going to say, "Oh wow, this person has a ton of Bitcoin," and if they're criminal in their behavior, that could be a problem, right? So
exactly. So I would say that for people, just to kind of give you a clear idea of maybe where to start, anyways, I think it's a good idea to have like one bigger UTXO and then maybe like 4 or 5 smaller ones, slightly smaller, and then you can kind of just go from there. But I would say don't have 1,000 UTXOs and don't have one UTXO either. I think somewhere kind of in between there. You can always consolidate later. You can always make adjustments later, but that's kind of where I would tell people to get started with it. So
it's like how many dollar bills would you want to have in your bank in your wallet, right? If you would you want to have 10,000 $1 bills? Would you just want to have one $10,000 bill? Like
exactly.
Either way, you're either exposing to everybody that you have one $10,000 bill, or you're just making your life a lot harder by having 10 1,000 or 10,000 $1 bills.
That's a good way to put
Perfect
it.
way to end it. Yes.
Yeah.
That's very well said. Okay. Well, thanks, fellas, for another episode here. And again, all of our information, all of our channels are in the show notes. Thank you for watching. We appreciate it. And we hope you're learning something here. So thanks, fellas. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you wanted to support this channel, the best way to do so is by becoming a member. You get access to replays of my live streams, exclusive members only content. Depending on when you're watching this, that will be 21 steps to Bitcoin mastery. It's not available as of recording this, but maybe by the time you're watching this or into the future, I'll be releasing those. Also, you can support this show by checking out the sponsors, all linked below. Bitcoin Well, which offers non-custodial Bitcoin, which means you send them money, they send you Bitcoin directly with the lowest spread in Canada and the US. They have non-KYC options available. And if you use my link in the description, you'll actually get some free bonus Bitcoin. And of course, Stamp Seed, the best possible way, in my opinion, to store your generational wealth and your seed phrase, which is this small little titanium plate that is easy to conceal, fireproof, crush proof. You can throw anything at it, it'll weather it, and you can stamp your seed with their kit, and you can actually get 15% off of that kit by using my code BTC not crypto 15. Thanks again.